Hold on. All right, I'm good. Hey, I'm Justin Toppins. Welcome to a different episode of the Sheol podcast. I'm sitting here with my buddy Brad Clower, and we are going to talk about the film "The Case for Heaven," based on Lee Strobel's book, and what we thought about the movie, how it kind of applies to a lot of the content on the show, and then just kind of get Brad's thoughts on it. So, Brad, how you doing?
Doing great. We're here on vacation, having a good time. It's been a great week. Some a little bit of shaky weather, but we've had a good time.
Yeah, I don't mind the clouds once in a while
No,
out here.
no, we need a break from the heat.
We do. So, what's your background?
So I had a time in ministry and spent some time in seminary as well. And so you had talked about this, and really this whole podcast has been amazing to follow and to see the progression of it and to learn some of these insights because I've always heard about NDEs, but I kind of just brush it off, which a lot of people do. But as these more educated um, answers are starting to come out, and it's becoming more tangible, and so I think that's something that's really kind of sparked my interest. And so I definitely think that there's some and just death that I've experienced in my own life. There's a lot of interest. I lost my dad a couple years ago, and this is something that has I've had mixed feelings with, to be really honest, where it's been kind of painful to think about, but also incredibly encouraging. And so I think that's really a big part of this.
And I think that's one of the things that we try to get across to a lot of
Hmm.
listeners and viewers is the idea that a lot of this stuff used to be wishful thinking or based on hope, and thanks to people like Bruce Grayson, even Alexander, the evidence for the source of consciousness is becoming more and more overwhelming.
For sure.
That we're living in a post-materialist, situation here. But you also watched The Case for Heaven.
I
Have you read
did.
the book?
I haven't.
Okay, I haven't read the book either. Um, but yeah, what were your first thoughts on the movie?
Well, overall, I think it was like really well made. Like I enjoyed. Like it was enjoyable to watch. Like it wasn't because some documentaries are so it's like drinking sawdust, But this had such. It just had even like the camera angles. I mean, I know that's kind of side the point, but like that has something to do with it, you know.
Absolutely,
Um,
yeah.
and I thought the contributors throughout were just very crisp and clean and to the point, just really refined. I liked it a lot. I mean, just to be able to, I enjoyed it, and there was a lot of thought provoking things and things that I kind of perked my interest, and some things I'm like, I'm not sure about it, but some really good perspectives. And Lee Strobel's, I mean, he's a legend. I mean, he's a really relevant figure, and I've learned a lot. Case for Christ, obviously, is a massive hit growing
Yeah,
up, and
huge bestseller for him.
oh, massive.
I mean, before you saw this movie,
Mm-hmm.
what were your? Did you have any preconceived notions about near-death experiences, or kind of what the type of content that they
Mm-hmm.
brought?
I think it's more of for the longest time in for NDEs, it was like the same sort of story retold over and over, but I felt like the documentary exposed some different scenarios that were like they were very different. Each of them were very separate issues, situations, parts of the world. I think that's a huge part too. I mean, we can talk more about that later, but like there was a lot of different parts, and it wasn't just the United States, and so I think there were some things that I was expecting to be more um, like ghosts, almost like a paranormal kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
But seeing the way they described everything, kind of put things in a real way and less mystical and more, I guess, factual. I mean, that might be a little bit of a stretch, but you know what I'm saying. Like it is kind of that. It makes it more real.
Well, there's evidence there. I
Evidence,
think that's the
yes.
thing. I mean, when you hear these stories, and prior to this, we can credit Raymond Moody for naming
Oh,
NDEs for us, and thank you again, Dr. Moody, for being on the show. But um, his sort of unfolding the evidence of the world, and then the progression with Dr. Grayson and what he's
Hmm.
done. It is, there's a lot of evidence. This is evidence based research at this point, instead of it just being ah, maybe we have a soul, how does that work? But let me ask you this. The first note that I made from watching the documentary was the idea that human beings spend a lot of time pretending that death doesn't exist. And if you look at very religious people, I think that's not really um, the case. I was telling you this week about how I was reading, Brother Lawrence, and the way
Hmm.
that they used to pray with like a skull, and always reminding themselves that death was ever present. And at least in like Western culture, that is not something I think we do almost everything we can to avoid the idea of death and the concept of death, because it is so mysterious to us. Um, what did you think? Do you think that that's accurate, or do you think there's
Oh, for sure. I think I could not, I forgot the guy's name. Maybe you can help me out, but he had the quote. He said, "Denial doesn't work without distraction." And that was the first note I made. That was something that really stuck out. Um, and the fact that people choose, they want to think about what all they can do on Earth, but they don't really think about what is on the other side. They kind of they want to try to avoid that at all cost. Um, and I think it might have been later on. I think Lee Strobel might have mentioned something about people being embarrassed. Like there's an
yeah?
embarrassment about it. I think that's the word that he used of talking about it. Um, and I really don't think there should be any shame behind it. I think that's something that we've kind of created, unfortunately, but as a society. But yeah, no, I thought that was a really relevant point.
I did too. That we talk about that with almost every guest that we've had.
Mm-hmm.
It's this idea of normalizing these conversations, because another thing I made a note on was the idea that 1 out of 10 Europeans have had a near death experience, because it's such a high number that at some point we have to have open dialogue here, and we can't
Yes.
just pretend that this isn't happening, because again that goes back to our point that we just ignore
Right.
the idea of death completely. Um, yeah, I mean, I wanted to. One thing that I made a note of, and I had talked to John Burke really recently. I think he was on the show like a few weeks ago,
Mm-hmm.
and something that he brought up, that he also brought up in the documentary, that I found was really interesting, was this idea that biblical ideas of heaven, like looking at heaven, from a biblical perspective, could be metaphorical in some ways. And I think because you grew up evangelical, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so I did
Mm-hmm.
too,
Mm-hmm.
for full disclosure.
Right.
Um, and I think some of these ideas are not, they're not well communicated. They're not discussed at all
Mm-hmm.
with our upbringing. The idea that maybe, one that he pointed out on our show was this guy described like these gates as being like translucent,
Mm-hmm.
white pearl color, and how that could coincide with the idea of the pearly gates from the New Testament. Was there anything that stood out to you in that section?
Well, I want to mention something too. Is that if I were to bring up something like this in seminary, I would have gotten ridiculed pretty quickly. Like I mean, it was not accepted, and I hope that's changed. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I probably would err on the side of probably not,
Yeah, I
but
didn't think
but
so.
maybe with work like these fantastic men and women are doing, maybe that'll change. But I'm sorry, what was your original question? I just wanted to mention that.
Well, I mean, I think the question is, um, what do you think about those connections that John Burke was making between near-death experiencers' descriptions of what they see,
Hmm.
and biblical concepts of the afterlife?
I have the hardest part. I have the hardest time pinpointing that or really factoring that in because I think there's so much that our minds and what our imaginations are. Because, as you said, we grew up in evangelical. We were told that kind of what heaven would be like, but nobody really knew. Nobody really knows. And so I feel like there's some of those things where um, I feel like that could weigh heavy in some of those experiences, and that's what I always kind of fall back to. But I will say, that with listening to the podcast, it's helped me give those folks a little bit more grace and understanding, because who am I to say that they were hearing the same message I heard growing up? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm at with that. It's like I feel like it could be manufactured easily. Like it's just such a sensitive thing that you just have in your mind of what you think heaven might be, or hell, as it's talked about in the documentary, which I appreciated, by the way, that they really did address both very well. I thought there's good balance.
Yeah, and Howard Storm's story is
Oh yeah,
truly I mean,
whew.
that also flips some of that stuff on its head. And I
Mm-hmm.
think what's hard about doing because we talked about this before, and for me watching it, I wanted to see more science-based discussion. I wanted to hear them bring people like Bruce Grayson in,
Mm.
because here's a guy who, if he gets criticism, he goes, looks at it, and addresses it. And if he's wrong, he'll accept that he's wrong. And for a lot of these researchers, they're stuck between the religious folks who are like, this is the interpretation that we're holding to, and the scientific perspective, where it's pretty much, at least it's becoming more accepted, obviously, thanks to people like Bruce Grayson. But
Mm-hmm.
for a long time, it was laughable. I
For
mean, I
sure.
worked in healthcare, and I remember I've told the story several times where I talked to a patient who was describing, like, floating above the surgical table
Mm-hmm.
and telling me what the surgeon was doing, and I was like, "Oh man, you got to watch out for the patient and
For
because
sure.
that's the way we're taught to look at it from a clinical perspective." Um,
Well, John Burke's wife mentioned that, how that, I mean, it took a toll on, like, that was such like a heavy burden to carry through, and that's what makes John Burke such a noble man, and his wife being a noble woman. I mean, to be able to go and kind of be bold about that, because he was kind of chasing this stuff in the pastoral realm in the late '80s, I believe is what they said, and so that's a big feat. Like that takes some guts for sure. But she could tell in the way that she was describing it that it was a hard thing to do. Even her thing, she said, like their pastor friends were, had a hard time accepting that's where he was spending his time, and really that was his kind of his niche.
yeah, and I'm always like, he has a story which always kind of draws me in. The fact that his father dying of cancer, and
Mm-hmm.
saying, "I want to learn more about this," because he stumbled across Raymond Moody's book, and that started the journey for him.
That's
But
amazing.
let me ask you this, because we talked about Pamela Reynolds, um, and her story stood out. They mentioned the person who had the near-death experience and saw the shoe on the roof.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as someone who is not extremely well versed in near-death experiences, did you find any of the evidence compelling, or did you think it needed a little more perspective? How did you feel about that?
Maybe this is just me being cynical, but I felt like it just made for an awesome story. I think it just made for an awesome story. I'm not saying it wasn't true, but it's interesting. Okay, trying to figure out how to say this. The Why was the shoe relevant? What was it about the shoe? Like, why couldn't it have been like that's a random place for a shoe to be?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like in a lot of the near-death experiences, where we're the outer body experiences, it's more like that hovering aspect.
Yep.
I don't really think about the ascension part. Does that make sense? Because
Well,
even in the John Burke story with the girl who got the horse that bucked, that she went and fell, she was like hovering over the body. Like that's what you hear more of. But that whole like the ascension part is the part that I thought was a little bit kind of hard for me to follow.
yeah, I think a lot of people will probably feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
That's when, if you want to start with criticisms of this documentary, I'm with you. I thought cinematography wise, what's the director's name? Uh,
Manny,
I'm gonna feel bad that we're talking about this. Manny Sandoval.
yeah,
Yeah, he did
Sandoval,
incredible job.
very
Manny,
good.
great job. The cinematography was great everywhere.
And he provided some great commentary too.
He
He
did.
did.
He did. the story leaned heavily on Lee Strobel himself,
Mm-hmm.
and if you're somebody who knows his background, that's not a bad thing because I didn't know the story about him and his dad. I didn't know a lot about him at all,
Mm-hmm.
and so that was interesting. But I don't know that his story alone makes a case for heaven by itself.
Right.
So another thing I really want to talk about with you while we're on this subject is Steingard and Hawk Nelson. To
Yes.
me, that is like, I mean, that's one of the main reasons, honestly, that we're doing these type of conversations on this podcast. It's about consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found, coming from an evangelical background, is all of these folks that we grew up with. You go to church, you hear like these huge worship bands, right?
Mm-hmm.
Back when, I mean, name a worship band from that time period that you liked.
Uh, Way back, Stephen Curtis Chapman, Michael
Okay.
W. Smith. I could name a bunch.
Yeah, and
But
they were
yeah.
huge. That
Oh,
was a very
massive.
like regular part of our
Oh
culture.
yeah.
And to see some of these people leave the faith is crazy because you're saying, all right, these were the people sort of holding up worship in modern churches,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't believe it anymore. And I think that deconstruction is happening like all over the Western world.
Absolutely.
And I hear a lot of people talk about their deconstruction process, and that's great. It's healthy to let everybody know that that's okay, and that if you're going through that, that's okay. But what I think is particularly hard is there also, when you listen to a lot of people, Mike McHargue, for example, wrote an entire book about finding God after losing God. But the biggest thing that I took away from his book is how painful it
Yes.
was to mourn the loss of his faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need more people talking about that. Yeah, what do you have to add about Hawk Nelson?
Well, first off, I loved them in high school. They were great. I loved them. But I thought he was just his humility. He was completely vulnerable and humble through that conversation. I mean, you tell you he was comfortable with having that conversation, which I appreciated a lot. But it's just it's that's a heavy weight to bear as a Christian music artist or a worship leader. Like you're leading all these people. Same for a pastor, right? I mean, I feel like that's kind of goes hand in hand. But like that, you have to hold up that kind of that belief, and you have to hold up that sort of stamina of the faith. I mean, that's something that can really wear you down. And if you're having those doubts, I mean, I remember having those experiences in, um, in ministry and even through seminary, where I'm just like, gosh, should I even be pursuing this if I'm having these kinds of doubts? But I mean, really, Scripture supports having those doubts and being, really challenging the faith because, I mean, God can handle it. He can handle that kind of questioning. It's not gonna hurt his feelings. He knows he's very comfortable with who he is, but he just wants us to be more comfortable with him. And so that's something that I feel like in the documentary, the Hawk Nelson lead singer, what was his name again?
Steingard.
Steingard.
Yeah.
Yes, that's something I felt like that you could just see. You almost see it in his face. It is like his body language of what kind of toll that took on him through that time.
Yeah. And I appreciate that honesty too from somebody like him
Oh yeah.
and not coming at it. I almost felt like, and I don't want to criticize somebody going through a process like that, but like when Joshua Harris's experience, right? And when he kind of came out, it was pretty, I think, negative um, in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it may have, obviously his personal life could play a role in that, in the way I'm
Sure.
perceiving that. But yeah, I think that it's much easier to start a conversation because what a lot of people do is immediately say, I don't believe that, I hate that, I'm not going to be a part of that anymore,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just sort of being open to
Sure.
a discussion.
And also not putting and I don't want to stray too much off topic, but not to put all of your faith in you want to lean too heavily on the church for your faith because we're broken, we're people, so you got to lean on what God's word says and your faith and things like that. Like that's also that burden as well, is knowing that people do lean on you in that way. um, but that's something that we have to make sure we're careful of, because that's not fair to those that are leading our churches, that we're leaning on them to have that kind of to be that cornerstone for us. We need to put that in Christ and what the Word says.
So for people who are seeing some, like, I think there's a, and I want to move past this, but I think there is a connection um, between people who are seeking a little bit, trying to find, real answers, and these near-death experiences, because we
Mm-hmm.
are learning some realities, no matter what you believe, whether you're Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, it doesn't matter. A lot of these experiences are pretty similar between folks,
Mm-hmm.
and to be able to say, like, we have an episode with Graham Standish that's coming out, and we talked about the idea of mystics and the role
Mm.
that they played
Sure.
in the early formation of the Christian faith that they don't really play anymore. Um, and I do think that's something that's going to have to change, because what he pointed out is that a lot of the folks who are leaving are basically saying, I want to be more spiritual, less religious. And I look at the church and see that it's more religious, not very spiritual. And that's kind of, I think, one of the things I hope people are willing to be open to with this
Absolutely.
show. Um, but let's talk about, like, maybe the one of the biggest things in the documentary, which is Howard Storm and his story, because I think that also flips a little bit of the things that we're taught as, well, not just evangelicals. I mean, I think a lot of people look at hell in a way that is, we've kind of come up with in the last 100 years or so,
Mm-hmm.
the devil and fire and all those things. And Howard Storm's experience wasn't quite like that. What did you take away from him?
So, so this is interesting. So as he was telling the story, I had a I remembered growing up and um, in a really small town, rural town, and I went to a vacation Bible school. And it was one of the last nights. And, typically the last night, that's when they try to do the altar call or, that kind of thing. And we were in this room and there was, I don't know, maybe 6 to 8 of us. And I might have been 10 to 12 ish. And our leader in the class turned off all the lights. Should be an automatic, kind of odd, but turn off all the lights and turn on music. And I don't know if this, I feel like I remember this being a thing. Like I hear my parents talk about it, that there were somebody sent a microphone really deep into the earth or something, and they picked up like these voices
Yeah. For
of things.
that was like a Russian mining thing that it was like all over social media for a while. I
Yes.
remember that. Yeah.
And so during that time, they played that, and he read from Revelation about like I think it was Revelation, gnashing of teeth and things like that. He was reading that as that was playing. So they literally scared the hell out of us. And so that's kind of what was put in my brain. I was so scared to go to hell. I wanted to live right because I was so scared of what hell was. And so hearing his story, and as I've obviously grown, I've changed my perceptions on those things, and as I've studied scripture and things like that. But his story, I thought, was one of the most real, honest, and true explanations of what I could see hell actually being.
Yes.
I mean,
The
it
ability
wasn't
to,
crazy. It wasn't over the top. It was just being absent.
yeah, is the absence of good, right? Like the absence of the presence of God is whatever you're pursuing,
Mm-hmm.
and typically not good.
Right.
Um, and I think the other thing about these stories, and some that, again, we talked about a lot of stuff that's not in this documentary, but
Right.
Howard Storm is a very sincere guy.
Absolutely.
It's hard to hear his story and hear the criticisms that a lot of these guys get
Mm-hmm.
and go, I mean, you don't know this guy. You don't
Mm-mm.
know how authentic he's trying to communicate something, because when people have these near death experiences, Eben Alexander has a very different perspective
Sure.
on the world and the afterlife than a lot of these guys. Um, and he takes similar criticism.
Absolutely.
And people say to him, you had a bad dream. That's all this is.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the thing is, these experiences for a lot of people are verifiable.
Yeah.
When I do the research on a lot of these topics before we talk to somebody, we can look at stories and go, this one is verifiable by someone else who was present,
Right.
and that happens with like shared death experiences very commonly. Jeffrey Long's experience, I would I'm going to offer that as a criticism of this documentary, because if I'm making a documentary about near-death experiences and evidence for an afterlife, I'm having a guy who is telling you that he had multiple conversations with his deceased wife after she
Mm-hmm.
passed away, and the surgeon who was with him in the hospital also saw his deceased wife. There's no logical explanation for that.
Mm-mm.
It's really easy to just dismiss some of this stuff, but I don't know how you can dismiss stories like that. I'd like to have seen more of that.
I completely agree. I think there's definitely there's some depth missing, and like the music uh, portions of the documentary.
Hard to follow.
That was
hard
rough. I mean, it was beautiful stuff. Again, shot amazingly well. It didn't really track with me as I don't think it hit the way that it was supposed to with me as it was intended.
I don't think so either. I think that was probably
Yeah,
an artistic choice somewhere. I don't know if that was Lee Strobel or.
I'd love to know though. Maybe there's more to it that maybe just went right over my head, which is very possible.
I feel the same way.
Yeah,
I feel that way a lot of times. I have these conversations.
Sure.
With the see me theory.
Yes.
I spent probably, for full transparency, like 48 hours trying to learn what he was talking about.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I think overall, I think it's the type of documentary where if you were already a fairly religious person, and if you're a Christian, you follow Lee Strobel, you're probably a big fan of certain areas of this documentary. But then I think some of the stuff about hell specifically,
Mm-hmm.
and you're looking at stuff where they talk about whether a certain part of the Bible is allegorical as opposed to a real tangible thing.
Sure.
And that's tough.
Absolutely.
That's been one of the hardest things for me in having those conversations with people. Is most people who are super bitter, super angry about some part of the Bible don't take into account that Jesus, when he told a story, was like, I'm going to tell you a story. He didn't say this is the thing that happened. And the idea that, like, I was thinking about what you said
Mm-hmm.
with going to church and the guy playing the which I think that video was a hoax, by the way.
Yeah,
but playing that to sort of scare people is not what Jesus had in mind if you look at the New Testament, because he was at a time where there were plenty of rabbis wandering around. It wasn't just Jesus.
Nope.
Right? And the process of that is getting an apprentice,
Mm-hmm.
having somebody learn from you, follow you, be with you. And that is something that I think is just completely lost on Western Christianity.
Absolutely.
It's because to say, walk down the aisle, say this prayer, and then live a good life from there
Mm-hmm.
is it's not doing it for
No.
most people.
So who's this documentary for?
That's a good question. I think, like a lot of Lee Strobel's work,
Mm-hmm.
the idea is I'm going to put some stuff out there that I'm passionate about, that I feel like is effective. He feels that his evidence in terms of like the case of Christ
Right.
is ironclad, right?
Absolutely.
And
Yep.
I think
he
that
stands
making
by it.
this he wanted to use this type of project to use this research to share his faith with more people. I mean,
Mhm.
that's what I think he's trying to accomplish with it.
And I love his heart. Like I really, he's got such a he wants to get it out. Like he has such a vocal heart. I don't even know if that makes sense, but like he just has that. He wants to tell. He wants to share these things. And I love that his wife, like their alignment on some of this. I thought that was inspiring just for my own marriage. Like for her to have that complete acceptance of, hey, I had to come to the fact that I was going to lose him. I thought I was going to lose you. I just thought that was such a raw and real thing. That's real life.
Oh
You
yeah,
know,
because most people that have these NDEs have a lot of difficulty maintaining relationships.
sure,
Because if you see what you believe is
interesting.
reality,
Mm,
you don't have. I'm not going to name names because I think that's kind of not fair. But
sure.
I've talked to folks who
Hmm.
had the NDEs and then their marriage dissolved because the person that they become after um, is different.
Right.
It's hard for them to continue to um, be who they were. Yeah, that's a tough question. I think it's great. I think that you guys, especially our audience, would like
Hmm.
um, the documentary. There's definitely things that could have been better. I would want to see more people like um, Bruce Grayson, who is going before um, the United Nations and giving people evidence that there is consciousness that's maybe supports the idea of like the filter theory, where
Hmm.
our brains are just sort of filtering out things that aren't helpful to survival, right? And that's why we're not as aware of these other
Sure.
because more and more people have different theories on how to get there,
Right.
but it's like meditation. I
Hmm.
mean, I don't remember as a kid hearing people talk about meditation being important. Um, I never heard about things like centering prayer
Right.
when I was younger. So some of this stuff I think it is helpful. Um, and yeah, I mean, I guess overall I would say watch it and kind of formulate your own opinion. Um, but it was definitely worth the time, if nothing else, for the cinematography, which is
Oh yeah.
incredible.
Very well done.
Yeah, what do you think? You have any other thoughts?
Well, I did. We talked about this earlier. I love seeing Francis Chan. Yeah, it was great to see him back, in something and getting his, kind of his hand. He's got such a just a beautiful way of putting things, and it really it hits you. He's such an emotional guy, and seeing him standing. Well, I don't want no teasers here, but or spoilers. But he was just standing at the grave and kind of looking at it and just seeing it for what it was, and kind of describing how he felt, and that was really powerful. Hearing him speak, and um, I really did enjoy that part quite a bit, and seeing him. And but no, I think it's great, for anyone to watch. I mean, and it's okay to not agree with everything, and it's okay to. Uh, I think it will challenge people's thought. I think it will do what it was supposed to do, or it does what it's supposed to do. I think.
I hope so.
I
But
do
I think
too.
I think it's a good point you made too. I didn't even mention that. But as much as I felt like the part of the documentary that focused on Lee Strobel, for example, his personal story, his background,
Hmm.
and Francis Chan, his personal story, his background, there's still really compelling stories. I
Absolutely.
mean, both of those guys, the family dynamics,
Hmm.
um, man, if you've ever had like, you know, dad issues or something,
Sure.
that's a strong section of the story. But also, again, yeah, I just want to see more. I am like an evidence based guy for the most
Absolutely.
part, and I like seeing that pushed into stories like that, so that people who would listen to Neil deGrasse Tyson every day, right?
Sure.
And that's a lot of folks, right? I mean,
Oh
I listen
yeah.
to Neil deGrasse Tyson, but
Same.
I think at the same time, the idea that people we were talking about deconstruction, right? And I've
Hmm.
said this several times, so if you watch the show or listen to the podcast, I apologize for doing this again. But the idea that these incredibly committed folks to an atheistic worldview in science, they cling to it as if they're going through their own deconstruction. Because all the evidence that's pouring in regards to consciousness tells us we have to move past this materialist worldview. We have to move past it
Hmm.
because we're finding out more things. And if we're willing to cling to, you know, literal dinosaurs, right,
Right.
then we're not going to learn anything. Um, that's the biggest takeaway for me. I hope that anybody, if you're watching this and that's your perspective, do some research. I look at all the
Absolutely.
stuff that UVA is doing. Um, North Texas actually has a lot of good stuff in their research. So, um, yeah. And then also, of course, you got um, folks at is it NYU? Ask my producer. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great research you can look at, and hopefully be a little more open minded about it. So
Sure. And I think really the last thing is I really did appreciate this as well. They didn't do it wasn't a big like heavenly tourism approach. They stayed away from that, like the heaven is for real kind of vibe. Like they
yeah,
like that was I. You know what?
it's just turning
Actually,
more
you're
people off, unfortunately,
yes.
because will see stuff, and then there's a story, right, that's a hoax, and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, everybody just throws that out the window. That's I get it. I
Mm-hmm.
get why you want to throw it out the window, but you shouldn't do it. It's short sighted. There's a lot of evidence out there um, that consciousness is not coming from the goo inside our skulls. So,
Right.
um, yeah, that's
For
all I got
sure.
on that. Thanks for being here, man.
Oh,
I
thanks for having me.
appreciate
Really
the
enjoyed it.
time and chatting about this. So, yeah, hopefully we can do this again.
So that'd be
And
great. I'd love to.
thank you for watching.